Can you still smell a school dinner hall from 30 years ago? Not remember it. Smell it. That particular mix of boiled cabbage, gravy, and hot metal trays that hit you the second the double doors swung open. If you went to a British primary or secondary school in the 1980s or 90s, that smell is still filed away somewhere in your brain, ready to ambush you the moment someone mentions dinner ladies, plastic trays, or the word semolina. 15 dishes. Most of them loved. A few genuinely dreaded. All of them still living rent-free in your memory decades later. Fish and chips with mushy peas. Friday's fish dinner was practically law in British schools, a fixture of the dinner hall from the post-war years right through into the 90s. With no clear point it was ever introduced or dropped, it was simply always there. Whatever else had happened on the menu that week, Friday meant golden fish, a mountain of chips, and a scoop of mushy peas served up without fail. Queuing for it felt different too. The line moved faster on a Friday, everyone already knowing exactly what they were getting before they'd even reached the counter. Even now, the smell of chip fat and vinegar in a school corridor is enough to pull some people straight back to a Friday lunchtime they haven't thought about in years. Turkey Twizzlers. Spiral strips of processed turkey, breaded and deep fried into something closer to a snack than a meal, rose to prominence through the 1990s and became a genuine playground obsession. Nobody ever seemed bothered enough to ask what was actually in them. They lasted right up until 2005, when Jamie Oliver's School Dinners campaign got them banned outright, turning a childhood favorite into one of the most talked about food bans in British television history. Potato smiley faces. Smiley-faced potato shapes first appeared around 1990 and quickly became one of the most requested items in the whole canteen. There was something about seeing a face looking back up at you from your plate that made an ordinary side dish feel like an event, even if you couldn't quite explain why. What was your go-to school dinner order? Smiley faces and beans, or something else entirely? Chicken dinosaurs. Processed chicken pressed into dinosaur shapes was another fixture of that same 90s stretch, sitting in exactly the same category as Twizzlers. Fun to look at, questionable to think about too hard, and adored regardless. A plain chicken shape was just lunch. A dinosaur shape was something to show your mates before you ate it. Jam Roly Poly. Sweat pastry rolled around sticky jam, sliced into thick discs and drowned in custard, had been a staple pudding since the post-war rationing years and stayed on menus well into the 1990s without ever really going anywhere. It earned the nickname Dead Man's Arm from generations of cheeky school kids, and one look at a slice explained exactly why. School cake. A light sponge topped with white icing and hundreds and thousands sliced into uniform squares on a tray that never seemed to run empty. School cake became a staple of the school lunch menu, as school meal provision expanded through the 20th century, and it stuck around long enough that some schools still serve a version today. It's still the single dish most people picture first the moment someone says the words school dinner. Rice pudding with jam. Warm, sweet, and usually served with a spoonful of jam stirred through the middle, rice pudding was just as much a fixture in 1983 as it was in 1996. It didn't matter which decade you were sat in the dinner hall. The rice pudding on your tray looked exactly the same, tasted exactly the same. Manchester Tart. A short crust base, a layer of jam and a set custard filling finished with a scattering of desiccated coconut. Manchester Tart sat on pudding trolleys, quietly present for as long as most people can remember, and just as quietly gone from most canteens by the 2000s. It had a texture nothing else on the pudding rotation quite matched. That firm custard giving way under the spoon before the jam hit, and the coconut on top adding just enough bite to stop the whole thing feeling too soft. It wasn't the pudding kids fought over the way they fought over jam Roly Poly, but it had its quiet fans, the sort who'd ask the dinner lady if there was any tart left before anything else. Mention the name today to a room full of people who grew up eating it, and you'll get a genuine wave of recognition, the sort that comes from remembering something you'd assumed nobody else even knew existed anymore. Jam and Cornflake Tart. Buttery pastry, a layer of sticky jam and a topping of cornflakes bound together with golden syrup. This one was cheap to make in bulk and stuck around for exactly that reason, a long-running canteen fixture rather than a dish tied to any specific decade. The appeal was almost entirely about contrast. Soft jam underneath, a crunchy, almost caramelized topping on top, and a bite that somehow held both textures at once without either one taking over. It was the kind of pudding that looked deceptively plain sitting on the tray. Just pastry and cereal by the look of it, right up until the first mouthful proved otherwise. Plenty of people who grew up on it have tried recreating it at home since, usually with mixed results because whatever the dinner ladies were doing with that syrup to cornflake ratio never quite translates the same way in a normal kitchen. Cottage pie. Minced meat under a crispy-topped mashed potato crown, ladled out of enormous metal trays. Cottage pie was the kind of dish that was simply always on rotation, without anyone marking the day it first appeared. There was a particular satisfaction to watching the dinner lady's spoon break through that crisp potato top and hit the gravy-soaked mince underneath, the steam rising off the tray as she filled your plate. It was never glamorous, just reliable. Some days it came with peas, other days beans, but the pie itself barely changed from one serving to the next, which for a lot of children was exactly the point. It was the dish you could count on when everything else on the menu felt like a gamble, the reliable option that quietly got the whole haul through a Tuesday afternoon without a single complaint. Free school meals for thousands of families ended when the funding structure changed in the early 1980s. As the Conservative government elected in 1979 cut expenditure across public services, including school meals, removing the requirement for nutritional standards and opening the door to private contractors, competing to provide meals as cheaply as possible. That single funding change is a big part of why cheaper, more processed options like smiley faces and Twizzlers became so dominant through this era, right up until Jamie Oliver's 2005 campaign forced the whole system to change again. Most kids at the time had no idea any of that was happening behind the scenes. All they knew was what turned up on the tray that day: pink custard. Nobody could ever quite agree what flavor it was supposed to be. Strawberry, in theory. In practice, it was simply pink, turning up alongside puddings throughout the same decades as everything else on this list, with no real record of when canteens started using the food coloring or when they finally stopped. Liver and onions. This is the one nearly everyone names first when asked what they hated. It appeared on school menus from the 1960s onwards, cheap and easy to cook in bulk, and was largely knocked off menus by the 1980s, once schools and parents alike had had enough of it. Grey, rubbery, and usually boiled far longer than it needed to be. It's remembered by an entire generation as the single worst thing that ever landed on a school tray. Semolina, nicknamed frog spawn by every child who was ever forced to eat it. Semolina landed on school canteen menus in the 1950s and stuck around for decades afterward, splitting classrooms clean in half wherever it appeared. Cold, gluey, and served whether you wanted it or not, it's remembered by plenty of people as the dish that genuinely reduced them to tears at the table. Boiled cabbage. The most boring vegetable in British school history. Boiled cabbage was served alongside almost everything for as long as anyone can remember, with no specific decade it belonged to and no specific decade it left. It simply sat on the side of the plate, largely untouched, generation after generation. Spam fritters. A slice of tinned meat dipped in batter and deep fried until golden, spam fritters trace all the way back to the Second World War, when fish shortages meant chip shops and school kitchens needed a substitute that could still be battered and fried the same way. What started as wartime necessity somehow stuck around for decades afterward, still turning up on trays well into the 1970s, long after rationing had ended and there was no real excuse for it anymore, other than the fact that it was cheap, filling, and everyone already knew how to make it. It never had the devoted following of fish and chips, and it never had the reputation of liver and onions either. It just sat somewhere in the middle, a dish nobody got particularly excited about, but nobody actively dreaded. The sort of thing you ate without much comment, and had mostly forgotten by home time. The foods on this list hold a special place in my heart. None of it was fine dining, and none of it needed to be. A school dinner in the 80s and 90s ran on mashed potato, mystery meat, and puddings that somehow tasted better from a canteen tray than they ever did at home. Whatever was on your tray that day, the queue, the smell, and the dinner lady behind the counter are still exactly where you left them. If any of these 15 brought a memory straight back, good or bad, you already know exactly which one it was before you finished reading the title.